Russian President Vladimir Putin announces the withdrawal of Russian troops from Syria, saying the mission to defeat ISIL is now complete. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. In a surprise visit to Russian-operated Hamim air base in Latakia, Russian President told his troops it's time to return home. Putin gave the order to begin the withdrawal of Russian troops from Syria after a 2-year military campaign. Putin says Moscow and Damascus have accomplished their mission to destroy ISIL. Putin also added that conditions for a political settlement under the direction of the United Nations are now more favourable. The delegation for the Syrian government rejoined UN-sponsored peace talks in Geneva Sunday. The delegation had walked out a week ago when the opposition rejected any future role for President Bashar al-Assad. The negotiations are focused on a resolution unanimously approved by the UN Security Council calling for a transitional government and elections. And the United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF, is requesting the immediate evacuation of more than 130 sick children stranded in rebel-held eastern Ghouta, a suburb of the capital of Damascus. Health workers say many of the children are suffering from severe malnutrition. Schools have been closed for almost a month. Now, joining us from Damascus is Bassam Abu Abdullah. He's a political analyst and professor of international relations. From London, we are joined by Kamal Alam. He's a visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And here with us in the studio is Rafif Jouejati. She is a spokeswoman for the Syrian Women's Political Movement. And Emily Hawthorne is a Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor, a geopolitical intelligence firm in Austin, Texas. Thanks so much for all joining us. Really appreciate it. Bassam, let's start with you in Damascus. Vladimir Putin declaring victory in the war against terrorism in Syria. Is this a time for victory?
Yes, absolutely, because I think that this is a very important declaration after 2 years of Russian support of Syrian government in combating terrorism. Now we can declare that the ISIL is already defeated, but there are other groups of terrorist groups in different places in Syria now. They cannot change the strategic situation generally. So we are in front of a victory on terrorism, but not victory on other Syrian people. This is a very important moment, which I should mention. When we are declaring victory against terrorism, victory against terrorists, but not against any other Syrian group, because we are looking for the future for political settlement with other Syrian people who are maybe in other side of our political approaches. But anyway, this is very important moment to understand what I want to say.
Kamal Alam, before I get to you, I just want to play what Vladimir Putin had to say on this surprise visit to Syria, and then I'll get your reaction off the back.
In slightly more than 2 years, Russian armed forces, together with the Syrian army, destroyed the most battle-ready group of international terrorists. In this respect, I made the decision that a serious part of Russian military personnel based in the Syrian Arab Republic should return home to Russia.
Now, Kamal Alam, the word terrorist, of course, is bandied about a lot in Syria. Obviously, most actors can agree it's ISIL, but then Damascus calls essentially opposition groups as well terrorists. The Russian president kind of alluded to that. But what does this decision mean going forward? Does this help the peace process that has just reconvened in Geneva?
Yes, I think it's a gradual transition into the political peace process now, because most of the military fighting is done now. It's not quite over, as Professor Abdullah said from Damascus. This is a victory against most of the international terrorists, but there are still other groups that need to be sorted out. But most importantly, now I think it's a time for diplomacy. The Russians have played a key part in helping the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab army. And now Iran, Turkey and Russia, with the de-escalation zones, are going to look to talk rather than fight.
Emily, in Austin, Texas, Russia seems to be in the hot seat here, driving not just obviously what looks like a successful military campaign, if you look at where the Bashar al-Assad government were 2 years ago, but also increasing the centre of diplomacy as well. What does this mean?
I think Syria is really the most successful component of how Russia has been able to broaden its diplomatic credentials in the Middle East over the last really year. But Syria has been somewhat of a victory for Russia in portraying itself as this key mediator, and Russia's role really has been absolutely essential for Damascus to get to this point, and like the other panelists said, to be at this point where we can actually start talking about political settlement. Russia's been a key part of that. But I do think we have to look closely at what President Putin said and consider that Russia will have a long-term role in Syria as well, and there is a domestic desire for Putin to say that, you know, Russian troops are leaving very quickly. There are Russian elections in this upcoming year. But we have to look at the long-term role that Russia's going to be playing here as well, and that's going to be important for Damascus.
Rafif, how do you see this moment?
I see this a little bit differently than the other panelists, as you might guess. Certainly the defeat of terrorism, and I'll put terrorism in little brackets here, the defeat of terrorism is a good thing for all Syrians and all people. Certainly the defeat of ISIS is wonderful for Syrians. But what the regime of Bashar al-Assad calls terrorists is people like myself, civil society activists. What the regime calls terrorists are people like political activists who are opposed to the Assad regime, who've never taken up weapons. What are called terrorists in the regime in Damascus are those starving people in eastern Ghouta and all over the country. So I think we need to redefine terrorism.
These points we have heard over the last 7 years. Are we at a point now where there can be fruitful discussions in Geneva leading to some sort of roadmap? Because we've been here before. What are we on, Geneva 3.0, 4.0?
First of all, the division of terrorism is clearly. Nusra, I think, Mr. Rafif, she accepted with me that they are not civil activists, and in eastern Ghouta, when they are attacking civilian people every day, and I am in Damascus, we know that every one of us, he is going to the street and he don't know if he will die or he will live. So they are terrorists, absolutely. But I agree with you that any political activists, it's welcome. We are not against them, absolutely. And the Syrian government is working in Geneva with different groups of these people. This is first. Secondly, what I want to say that I cannot see in Geneva that there is a prospect or a perspective solution through Geneva, because Geneva, we should understand, it's not between Syrian government and opposition in all kinds of opposition, Riyadh or Moscow or Cairo, but it's between Syrian government and its allies and United States and its allies. While we are trying now to create a new process through Sochi Conference, which is, I think, more, we would see more representative of the Syrian people. Nobody can say in Riyadh or other opposition group to say that I am representing the Syrian people. They can say I am representing part of Syrian people. But I'm sorry to tell you that they are trying to represent the whole Syrian people, which is very wrong. But I can see that we are going to a diplomatic and political solution, because the military project against Syria is already defeated.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Rafif here, because obviously you made some charges that you want to respond to. But what seems to be the word coming out of Damascus is this UN process seems to be being sidelined for this sort of Russian-led Sochi process. And how does that fit in with what you're saying?
Right. So I believe in international political processes, as does the formal opposition, which was elected to represent the Syrian people in Geneva. We have adopted the Geneva Communique. We have adopted other international covenants, and we are abiding by Security Council resolutions that surround Syria. What the regime has failed to do is the same thing. The regime has failed to show up at the negotiations.
They've been walking in and out.
They've been walking in and out. I mean, even when they're there, they put in roadblocks to hamper any sort of progress. So it's more like trying to shake hands with one arm tied behind your back. So this is really ridiculous. Now, Russia...
Is that, sorry to interrupt, is that part of the fault of the opposition as well? Because they, very early on in the civil war, there wasn't a sort of united opposition. There were different camps involved in terms of influences, different sponsorship by outside countries and groupings. Did they miss their chance?
No, absolutely not. Of course, there were disparate groups within the umbrella opposition. Of course, there were different political ideologies. In many cases, there were Islamist ideologies that the secular opposition could not abide by. This is to be expected after 50 years of dictatorship and tyranny. This is the whole point of the revolution. The fact that the Assad regime could not discuss this openly with its political opponents and resorted to outright genocide is the reason we're at Geneva 4.0 and 5.0 and 6.0.
Kamal Alam, obviously frustrations on both sides, but you can see here that there is a turning point here, can't you, because of Russia's success, along with the Syrian government and Iran on the battlefield, that there seems to be this sort of new process which seems to be Russian-led. Where is that going? What can we expect?
I mean, absolutely. One can say, if you look at almost 1.5 years ago, you had Russian and Turkish militaries facing each other down. The Turkish Air Force shot down the Russian jet. But now, as we look at 2017 coming to an end, Turkey and Russia and Iran are sitting successfully, despite having very different political views and different objectives in the war. But diplomacy is coming through now. The military component obviously will not be completely over. There will be small skirmishes in the north. We have the Kurdish issue. We have the southern front with Jordan. We have Idlib, which will remain a big issue. But the most remarkable thing in the Russian diplomacy in Syria is they've managed to turn around Turkey after 1.5 years where Turkey and Russia were more or less at war with backing different sides. And Iran, because even Iran and Russia have different objectives, but they're all talking to each other. And it's between these three countries now how they see a resolution. And I think Astana has been very successful. Geneva hasn't been so successful for various reasons, whoever one wants to blame. But Astana has been successful. We've also seen the Egyptians coming on board.
Yes.
Egypt is also quite a player now in the reconciliation process. And there are some other Arab countries from the Arab League which are supporting the Syrian government, like Algeria, like Oman, and to some extent Kuwait as well. So things are looking brighter for the first time in 6 years.
Emily, one country we didn't hear there was the United States. There had been some finger-pointing that the US is essentially doesn't have a policy when it comes to Syria, or it's so confused you can't work it out. Is this the vacuum here being filled by Moscow, by Tehran, by others? And what do you think the US will do in terms of this push for some sort of diplomatic solution, political solution?
I think the United States is going to remain involved in Syria with respect to counterterrorism initiatives, but this administration made it very clear when it cut ties to a certain rebel training program earlier this year that it doesn't have as close of a link to the civil conflict in the war. And this has been part of a very confused Syria policy over the last several years coming from the United States. But the United States is going to remain committed to the anti-Islamic State fight, and that has a lot to do as well with the United States alliance with Baghdad and the government in Baghdad, and the fact that this anti-Islamic State fight is a transnational one. It's not just focused in Syria. But really, when we're looking at 2018, this is, as the other panelists have noted, Iran, Turkey, and Russia working to try and bring as much coordination between their different positions as possible to move towards a political settlement. Of course, there are big challenges and barriers in that, and that's what we'll see at these efforts at political negotiation. Iran wants a total military victory, so does the Syrian government. Turkey is really focused on the Kurds. Russia would like some sort of exit from the Syrian conflict while maintaining a long-term presence. And so these are some of the things that these different players are going to prioritize, and it's not all going to come out in the same way for each of them.
Thanks for laying that out, because it is a complicated situation, and that was very, very eloquently put.